My mother refused to come to my graduation unless I stood on stage and publicly apologized for humiliating the family a year earlier. This was something I never did and never would do. No apology means no parents there, she texted me. My dad agreed with her completely. They both forgot what that date meant and why I had picked it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who constantly underestimated your true worth today. My name is Harper, and I am 28 years old. I stood in the suffocating heat of the university staging area, wearing a heavy black graduation gown. All around me, other graduates were laughing and hugging their families. Fathers were straightening their daughters' caps. Mothers were handing over massive bouquets of bright yellow sunflowers. I stood completely alone in the corner of the room holding my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the backstage hallway. The text message from my mother Vivian had arrived just 2 minutes ago. I stared at the harsh words. Your father and your sister and I will not be attending today. Unless you step up to the podium, take the microphone, and publicly apologize for humiliating Trent and Bianca at your father's birthday last year, we are done. No apology equals no family. We are heading to your sister's launch party instead. Do not bother calling. I locked my phone screen. I did not shed a single tear. There was no lump in my throat and no tightening in my chest. Instead, a cold and sharp sense of absolute clarity washed over my entire exhausted physical body completely today. I thought about my mother, Vivian. She was the head of the event planning committee at our megachurch in Atlanta. She was a woman who cared infinitely more about maintaining her pristine social image among the Black elite than she cared about her own daughter's achievements. To Vivian, everything was always about respectability. Everything was about looking absolutely perfect for the massive congregation. I thought about my father, Desmond. He was a former bank branch manager who spent his life demanding extreme financial discipline from me, but blindly handed his life savings to his white son-in-law, Trent. He was a man who let his wife dictate every single relationship in his life. And then there was my older sister, Bianca. She was 32 years old and the undisputed golden child of the Williams family. Bianca treated real life like an endless social media campaign. She contributed absolutely nothing but expected everything from us. Beside her stood Trent. Trent was her 35-year-old white husband. He was an entitled man who loved to use my family wealth to fund his fake startup companies. Trent was the absolute undisputed king of subtle daily racial microaggressions today. He loved to call my career in historical real estate development a cute little cleanup hobby. He loved to talk down to me at family dinners, using a condescending tone while drinking expensive wine my father paid for. Exactly a year ago, I had refused to mortgage my tiny condo to fund his absolute garbage business plan. I called him out in front of everyone, and my parents labeled me a bitter and jealous hater. They demanded I apologize to the white man who was actively draining our family dry. I refused immediately, and now they were acting completely terrible. They were making good on their threat to abandon me on the biggest day of my professional life. I unlocked my phone. I opened the group chat. I typed 2 simple words: no worries. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I turned away from the crowded staging area and pushed through the heavy double doors leading into the main auditorium. The graduation hall was massive and grand. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of folding chairs. Families were pouring into the general admission seating quickly. They were chattering loudly and saving spots with coats and purses. I bypassed the general seating and walked straight down the center aisle toward the very front of the stage. I walked until I reached row A. This was the exclusive VIP section. I had paid $5,000 out of my own pocket to reserve these 4 velvet seats. I did it because Vivian had relentlessly complained that she needed front row access to take the perfect pictures for her social media pages. She wanted the church ladies to see how close she was to the beautiful main stage. She wanted to bask in the glory of my hard work without having contributed a single dime to my tuition. I looked down at the 4 empty chairs. A beautifully printed cardstock placard was draped across the seats. It read, "Reserved for the Williams family." I reached down and grabbed the thick paper. I gripped it tightly in my hands and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper was incredibly satisfying. I tossed the torn pieces onto the carpeted floor and turned my back on the empty seats. I scanned the bustling, loud auditorium slowly. I was looking for one specific person. I walked past the wealthy parents in their designer suits and expensive dresses. I bypassed the hovering university officials. Finally, I spotted him near the back entrance. Mr. Henderson was the elderly black janitor who had worked at this university for 30 years. He was leaning against his supply cart holding a broom and watching the wealthy crowds file into the room. His calloused hands gripped the wooden handle, and his kind, tired eyes scanned the room with quiet dignity. He always smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and sweet peppermint candies today. Mr. Henderson was not just a janitor to me. During my hardest semesters, when my parents completely cut me off financially to punish me for not supporting Trent, I had absolutely nothing. I practically lived in the architecture library, working through the night on an empty stomach. Mr. Henderson would find me there at 2 in the morning. He would unlock the staff break room and bring me warm plates of food his wife had packed for him. When I passed my hardest exams, his wife, Miss Clara, baked me a whole sweet potato pie. They checked on me constantly then. They cared when my own blood relatives forgot I existed. I walked straight up to him. He looked surprised to see me out in the crowd. "Miss Harper," he said with a warm smile, revealing a gold tooth. "What are you doing out here, baby? You are supposed to be getting ready to walk that stage." I smiled back at him, feeling a genuine warmth in my chest that my parents could never bring out of me. "I am ready, Mr. Henderson," I told him. "But I have a problem, and I really need your help with something very important." He stood up straight and looked concerned. "Anything you need, you just name it." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the 4 glossy VIP tickets with gold foil lettering. I held them out to him. "I need you to take these tickets," I said. "I need you to call Miss Clara and tell her to put on her best dress. I need you to bring your grandchildren. You are sitting in row A today." Mr. Henderson looked down at the tickets and his eyes went wide. He shook his head and pushed my hand away very gently then. "Oh no, baby, I cannot take those. Those are the $5,000 seats. Those belong to your mother and father. They are going to be here any minute to see their girls shine." "They are not coming," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. They decided a launch party for a fake wellness center was more important than my graduation. Those seats are empty and I do not want them to stay that way. I want the people who actually supported me to sit there. I want my real family in the front row. Mr. Henderson looked at me. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. He wiped a rough hand across his face and let out a shaky breath. He looked down at his uniform and said he did not have the right clothes for the front row. I told him he looked perfect exactly as he was. I pressed the tickets firmly into his palm and closed his fingers around them. "Go get Miss Clara," I told him. "The ceremony starts in 30 minutes. Do not be late." He nodded slowly, tightly gripping the tickets. "I will be right there, Miss Harper," he promised. "We would never miss this for the world," he added. I turned around and walked back toward the staging area, feeling lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of seeking my parents' approval had finally been lifted from my shoulders completely. I lined up with the rest of my graduating class as the traditional processional music began to play. We marched down the center aisle in 2 long rows. As I approached the front of the stage, I looked over at row A. Mr. Henderson was sitting right in the center seat. He had taken off his work apron very quickly. He was wearing a clean button-down shirt. Next to him sat Miss Clara, in a beautiful floral dress, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. 2 teenage grandchildren sat beside them, looking amazed by the view. Mr. Henderson caught my eye and gave me a bright, proud smile. I smiled back and took my seat with the other graduates. The ceremony dragged on with speeches about perseverance and dedication. The university president droned on about stepping into the future and overcoming obstacles. I barely registered the words. My mind was sharp and focused entirely on the clock ticking away now. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the exact moment my life would change forever. Finally, the dean stepped up to the podium to announce the names of the graduates receiving their master degrees. Row by row, we stood up and walked toward the wooden stairs leading to the stage. I stepped up the stairs, feeling the polished wood beneath my shoes. I stood at the edge of the stage, waiting for my turn. The dean leaned into the microphone. Harper Williams, Master of Science in Historical Real Estate Development. Just as my name echoed through the massive speakers, my phone. It vibrated violently against my thigh. It was a long, continuous buzz. I reached into my pocket and pulled the device out right there on the stage. I looked at the bright screen. It was an automated priority alert from the corporate banking system linked to my firm. I read the notification text. Bad debt acquisition complete. Property ownership of Oakwood Estate officially transferred to Harper Williams. Foreclosure deadline 5 p.m. today. I read the words a second time to ensure there was no mistake. The transaction had cleared. The trap was officially set. I glanced at the digital clock. It read exactly 3 in the afternoon. A slow, confident smile spread across my face. I looked out at the audience, but I was not seeing the crowd. I was seeing the faces of my mother, my father, my sister, and her arrogant husband. They thought they held all the power because they denied me their presence today. They thought they were punishing me by withholding their love. They had absolutely no idea that I now held the deed to the very ground they were standing on. I did not step forward to take the leather diploma cover from him. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked straight down the wooden stairs of the stage. The dean called my name again, a hint of confusion in his amplified voice, but I kept walking. The heavy fabric of my graduation gown felt suffocating in the afternoon heat. As soon as I reached the exit doors, I unzipped the black robe and let it slide off my shoulders, letting it fall straight into a nearby trash bin. I did not need a piece of paper to prove my worth anymore. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the blinding Atlanta sun. The valet brought my car around. It was a sleek black luxury sedan that I had paid for in cash 2 months ago. My parents still thought I was driving the beat-up compact car from my undergraduate years because I had deliberately stopped updating them about my life. I slid into the leather driver's seat and typed the address for Oakwood Estate into the navigation system. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. Oakwood Estate was one of the most breathtaking historic mansions in the city. It sat on acres of meticulously manicured land, surrounded by massive oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was the kind of property that screamed old money and exclusive access. My sister Bianca had rented the entire main floor and the grand terrace to host the launch party for her new luxury wellness center. It was a business that produced absolutely nothing, but existed entirely to give Bianca an excuse to call herself a chief executive officer on social media. I pulled through the towering iron gates and handed my keys to the valet. I smoothed down my tailored navy blue suit. The fabric was sharp, and the cut was ruthless. I looked exactly like the corporate predator I had become. I walked up the grand stone steps toward the massive double doors of the estate. The faint sound of a string quartet floated through the warm afternoon air, mingled with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy networking. I reached the top of the stairs and reached for the brass door handle. A hand slammed flat against the heavy wood, pushing the door shut before I could open it. I turned to see Trent standing there. He was wearing a light gray linen suit that fit a little too snugly around his waist, and a fake diamond-studded Rolex on his wrist. He held a flute of expensive champagne in his other hand. His face was flushed with alcohol, and the arrogant smirk that he always wore around my family was plastered firmly across his lips. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "I thought you would be too busy crying in a corner somewhere because nobody went to your little graduation ceremony." I stared at him, taking in the sheer audacity of this man. He was standing on the steps of a rented mansion wearing a suit bought with my parents' money, acting like he owned the entire world. "Oh wait," he continued, taking a slow sip of his champagne. "I forgot. The diversity scholarship grad made it to the big leagues today." He chuckled, leaning in closer so I could smell the alcohol on his breath. I am sorry, Harper, but this party is for real investors. We have important people inside. Church elders, city council members, people with actual capital. There is really no room for entry-level floor sweepers in there. Maybe you can leave a resume with the catering staff on your way out. For a brief second, the old Harper, the one who constantly tried to keep the peace and swallow her pride, almost reacted with anger. But that girl was gone. I looked at this mediocre man who had systematically drained my parents' retirement accounts to fund his delusions of grandeur. I did not feel anger. I felt absolute surgical precision. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. I did not break eye contact. I raised my right arm and deliberately brushed past him. In the process, I knocked my shoulder hard against his hand. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered against the stone steps, sending expensive alcohol splashing across the tips of his Italian leather shoes. "Hey," Trent yelled, jumping back and looking down at his wet shoes. "Watch where you are going." I stopped and turned to face him. I let a cold, dead smile spread across my face. "You should really be worrying about that rotting hedge fund of yours, Trent," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and quiet. "I heard the bank rejected your third loan application this month. Is that true?" The color instantly drained from Trent's face. His arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer panic. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around nervously to see if anyone had heard me. I took another step closer, dropping my voice even lower so only he could hear the poison in my words. "Your numbers are a joke, Trent. You have been shuffling money around trying to cover the massive losses from your crypto failures, but the walls are closing in." I tilted my head, studying his terrified expression. I raised my left wrist and made a great show of looking at my watch. "It is currently 3:45 in the afternoon," I noted. "The market closes in exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. Did you manage to scrape together that minimum interest payment yet? Or are they going to freeze your accounts before the sun goes down today?" Trent stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. "How do you—" he stammered, his voice shaking. "How do you know about that?" I did not answer him. I simply held his gaze, watching the arrogant white savior complex completely crumble into pathetic desperation. He was a fraud, and he knew that I knew exactly what he was. The satisfying silence stretched between us for a few glorious seconds. Before Trent could formulate another excuse, the heavy wooden door was yanked open from the inside. My mother, Vivian, rushed out onto the stone landing. She was wearing an extravagant emerald green dress and a massive matching church hat that looked ridiculous outside of a Sunday morning service. She took one look at the shattered glass on the steps and then locked her furious eyes entirely on me. "Harper," she hissed, lunging forward. She grabbed my arm with a grip tight enough to leave bruises. "What in the world are you doing out here?" I looked down at her hand gripping my suit jacket. "Let go of me, Vivian," I said coldly, refusing to call her mom. She ignored me completely and dragged me by the arm away from the main entrance, pulling me around the side of the stone balcony into a secluded corner, hidden behind a large row of manicured hedges. She looked around frantically to ensure no one from the party had followed us outside. "You dare show your face here without apologizing to your sister?" she whispered fiercely, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "After we explicitly told you that you were no longer welcome in this family until you made things right. Are you out of your mind?" "I am completely in my right mind," I replied smoothly, pulling my arm out of her grasp with a forceful jerk. "I came to attend the launch party. Is this not a public event to celebrate Bianca's newest scam?" "Do not you dare speak about your sister that way." Vivian spat, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "Bianca is building an empire. She and Trent are bringing real wealth into this family. And you show up here looking to start trouble just because you are jealous. Are you trying to humiliate me in front of the pastor and the church ladies? Half the congregation is in that ballroom right now." I smoothed the wrinkles from my sleeve where she had grabbed me. "I find it fascinating that your biggest concern is always the church ladies, Vivian. You skipped your own daughter's graduation to parade around a rented mansion just so you could pretend you belong to a social class that you cannot actually afford. You ungrateful little brat, she snapped, pointing a manicured finger in my face. We gave you everything. We raised you to be a respectable woman, and you turned into a bitter, hostile failure. You refused to help your family when Trent graciously offered to let you invest in his business. You embarrassed us in front of everyone at your father's birthday dinner. You owe Trent an apology. You owe Bianca an apology. And you are going to march in there right now, find a microphone, and beg for their forgiveness in front of the entire party. I let out a harsh, dry laugh. The sheer delusion of this woman was staggering. She honestly believed that her social pressure tactics and her emotional manipulation still held power over me. She actually thought she could bully me into public submission to save face for her favorite daughter and her worthless son-in-law. And if I refuse, I asked, tilting my head, what exactly are you going to do, Vivian? You already abandoned me on my graduation day. You already sent the message that I mean absolutely nothing to you, unless I am falling in line and funding your fantasies. You have no leverage left. Vivian's face turned a mottled shade of red. She stepped closer, her chest heaving with indignation. You think you are so smart, Harper. You think your little historic real estate degree makes you better than us? Let me tell you something. Trent and Bianca are about to close a deal today that will make them multimillionaires. They are buying this entire Oakwood estate. They are going to own the very ground you are standing on. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud right there in the bushes. The tragic comedy of my mother's absolute ignorance was almost too much to bear. Trent had obviously spun a massive web of lies to convince my parents that he was acquiring the estate rather than admitting he was drowning in catastrophic debt. Is that what Trent told you? I asked, keeping my tone dangerously mild. He told you he is buying Oakwood Estate today. Yes, he is, Vivian declared proudly, her chin lifting in a gesture of absolute superiority. The paperwork is being finalized as we speak. So if you want to remain a part of this family, you will walk into that ballroom, get down on your knees, and show some proper respect to the people who are actually building wealth. Because if you do not, you will leave this property right now, and you will never speak to any of us again. Do I make myself perfectly clear? I looked at the woman who had birthed me. I searched her eyes for any tiny shred of maternal instinct, any small, lingering hint of love or care for the daughter standing in front of her. There was nothing. There was only the cold, calculating glare of a woman who viewed her children purely as stepping stones for her own social climbing. You are perfectly clear, Vivian, I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper. I know exactly what I need to do now. I turned away from her and began walking toward the heavy double doors leading into the main ballroom. I did not look back as I heard her hurried footsteps following closely behind me. She probably thought she had won. She probably thought I was walking inside to deliver the tearful, groveling apology she so desperately craved. She was about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you push the family scapegoat completely past the point of no return. I pulled open the massive doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The noise of the party washed over me instantly. Hundreds of well-dressed guests mingled under the crystal chandeliers, holding flutes of champagne and pretending to care about a wellness center that did not actually exist. The room was a sea of pastel dresses and sharp suits. A perfect congregation of the city's elite mixed with the most judgmental members of my parents' megachurch. This was exactly the audience Vivian wanted for my humiliation. This was exactly the audience I needed for my absolute retribution. I scanned the crowded room, taking in the opulent floral arrangements and the massive banners displaying my sister's face. My eyes immediately locked onto the raised stage at the far end of the room. I was ready to end this charade completely. I walked further into the massive ballroom, letting the heavy wooden doors click shut behind me. The space had been completely transformed into a ridiculous shrine dedicated entirely to my sister's vanity. Massive silk banners hung from the high vaulted ceilings, displaying Bianca's face in extreme close-up with the words Oakwood Luxury Wellness Center printed in elegant gold script. There were no actual wellness products anywhere in sight, There were no business models, no service menus, and no staff members explaining the actual purpose of this grand opening. Instead, there were just endless tables of expensive champagne towers and catered appetizers paid for by stolen money. The church elite mingled in their Sunday best, talking loudly about investment portfolios and blessed opportunities while completely ignoring the fact that the entire event was a hollow scam. I kept my posture straight and my face completely neutral as I navigated through the sea of pastel suits and heavy, expensive perfume. It did not take long for the guest of honor to spot me in the crowd. Bianca separated herself from a group of wealthy church elders and marched straight toward me. She was wearing a $10,000 designer dress that sparkled blindly under the crystal chandeliers. Her hair was styled in perfect cascading waves, and a heavy diamond necklace caught the light with every step she took. She looked exactly like the golden child she had always been raised to be, completely untouchable and utterly delusional. She stopped 2 feet in front of me and crossed her arms over her chest, looking me up and down with obvious deep-seated disgust. "Harper," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby guests to turn their heads and listen. "I cannot believe you actually showed up here today. I heard you want to open some kind of cleaning business since your little degree did not work out." I looked at her, trying to find even a trace of the sister I used to play with as a child. There was nothing left. There was only a hollow shell of a woman who lived entirely for external validation and internet likes. "My degree is a Master of Science in Historical Real Estate Development, Bianca," I said calmly. "But you would know that if you had bothered to show up to my graduation ceremony 2 hours ago instead of preparing for this circus." Bianca waved her hand dismissively, acting as if my accomplishment was nothing more than a minor annoyance to her perfect day. "Oh, please, Harper." She laughed, a high-pitched grating sound that immediately drew more attention from the surrounding crowd. "Your historic preservation degree is basically just high-end janitor work anyway. You are just sweeping dust out of old buildings for a living. But listen, since you are actually here, I might have a proposition for you. If you get down on your knees right now and apologize to Trent for what you did last year, he might throw some floor-sweeping contracts your way. We are going to need a lot of maids for the new wellness center once we officially buy this estate." I felt a cold, dangerous smile forming on my lips as the memories of exactly what happened 1 year ago rushed back to the surface. It was at my father's 60th birthday dinner. We were sitting at a high-end steakhouse when Bianca and Trent cornered me before the appetizers even arrived. Bianca had demanded that I take out a second mortgage on my tiny one-bedroom condo. She wanted me to hand over every single ounce of equity I had built over 5 years of grueling corporate work just to fund Trent's brand new tech startup. When I asked to see the business plan, Trent had smirked and handed me a few printed pages full of tech buzzwords and absolutely zero financial projections. He had patted my hand condescendingly and told me that he knew complex financial models were hard for someone with my background to understand, but I just needed to trust his vision. I refused to sign my life away. I stood up at that dinner table and called his startup an absolute garbage fire. I told them Trent was using buzzwords to hide the fact that he had absolutely no idea how to run a profitable company. Instead of defending me, my parents turned on me instantly. Vivian had slammed her hands on the table and called me a disgrace to the family name. Desmond had called me a jealous, bitter hater who could not stand to see her older sister succeed. They blindly protected the arrogant white man who was using our family as his personal bank account, and they threw their own flesh and blood to the wolves without a second thought. They demanded I apologize for hurting Trent's fragile feelings, and when I refused, they labeled me the villain of the family. I looked Bianca dead in the eye right there in the middle of the opulent ballroom. "I am not sweeping floors for a man who cannot even keep his own bank accounts out of the negative," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly even and razor sharp. "And I am certainly not apologizing for protecting my own hard-earned assets when your husband tried to drain my condo to fund his gambling addictions disguised as a business venture." Bianca gasped loudly, placing a manicured hand over her chest in mock outrage. "How dare you?" she hissed, her eyes darting around the room to see exactly who was listening to our conversation. Trent is a visionary. He is bringing generational wealth to this family. You have always been nothing but jealous of me, Harper. You are so incredibly bitter that I am the one buying a historic mansion while you are still playing in the dirt. You selfishly refused to help your own family when we needed capital, and now you are just a sad, lonely hater trying to ruin my big night. The whispering started immediately around us. Several prominent women from my mother's church committee had stopped their conversations entirely and were now openly staring at us. They clutched their designer purses and shook their heads, whispering to each other about the rebellious younger daughter who had always been a stubborn thorn in the side of the otherwise respectable Williams family. Trent appeared beside Bianca, wrapping a protective, heavy arm around her waist. He had somehow recovered from his panic attack outside on the stone steps and was back to playing the confident, wealthy patriarch. He looked down at me with a smug, satisfied grin, clearly emboldened by the audience of church members who practically worshipped the ground he walked on. He loved this dynamic. He loved watching my family tear each other apart while he played the gracious victim. "Now, Harper," Trent said, using his most condescending and calm voice. "Let us not make a scene here. Bianca is just trying to be generous to you. We are willing to let bygones be bygones if you are willing to admit you were wrong and show some proper respect to the people who are actually building something meaningful." Before I could tear his pathetic, fragile ego to shreds, a loud, sharp tapping sound echoed through the massive ballroom. Someone was tapping a silver spoon against a crystal microphone. The low hum of the party instantly died down as hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the stage at the far end of the room. My father Desmond was standing at the wooden podium. He looked incredibly proud, wearing a custom-tailored suit and smiling out at the sea of wealthy guests. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat, letting a moment of dramatic, heavy silence build in the room. He always loved being the center of attention, and he loved the authority that came with his deep, booming voice. "Friends, family, and esteemed guests." My father began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the extraordinary vision of my eldest daughter Bianca and her brilliant husband Trent. They have shown us all what true ambition and dedication looks like. They are elevating the Williams family name to heights we have never seen before." The crowd broke into polite, enthusiastic applause. Trent puffed out his chest, and Bianca leaned her head affectionately against his shoulder. My father held up a hand to quiet the room so he could continue his speech. "But the Williams family also prides itself on accountability and grace," my father said, his tone shifting from celebratory to deeply serious. "We believe in forgiveness, but we also believe that mistakes must be publicly acknowledged before that forgiveness can be granted." My father slowly scanned the crowd until his eyes locked directly onto me. The warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by a stern, cold, authoritarian glare. He looked at me not as a daughter who had just earned her master's degree entirely on her own, but as a disobedient subordinate who needed to be brought to heel. Today, he continued, his voice echoing loudly over the speakers, "My youngest daughter, Harper, has decided to join us. As many of you know, there was a highly regrettable incident last year. An incident born of jealousy and misunderstanding that caused deep fractures within our tight-knit family. But today is a day of new beginnings and healing. Harper, I am calling you up here right now. It is time for you to come up to this stage, take this microphone, and make amends for your terrible mistakes. It is time for you to publicly apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law for your unacceptable behavior." The entire room turned to look at me simultaneously. Hundreds of eyes locked onto my face, waiting to see what I would do. The judgment in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. The church elite began to swarm around me, slowly closing the physical distance. The older women in their extravagant hats and the deacons in their sharp suits formed a tight, suffocating circle around me, cutting off any clear path to the exit doors. They were smiling tight, forceful smiles, pressing me forward toward the stage. They were murmuring words of encouragement that sounded more like veiled threats. "Go on," Harper, one woman whispered, tapping my shoulder. Make it right with the Lord and your family. Do the right thing, child, an older man muttered, blocking my way backward. They were waiting for me to break under the immense social pressure. They were waiting for the stubborn scapegoat to finally bend the knee and surrender her dignity to the golden child. They honestly believed that the weight of public humiliation would force me to grovel and beg for a place back in their toxic hierarchy. They had absolutely no idea what was actually about to happen. I kept my head perfectly straight as the sea of designer dresses and tailored suits parted for me. The walk from the back of the grand ballroom to the elevated stage felt like walking through a gauntlet of pure judgment. The members of my parents' megachurch had formed a tight, suffocating circle around the center aisle. These were people who had known me since I was a child sitting in the front pews. Now they were looking at me with thinly veiled contempt. They were whispering to each other behind their champagne flutes and their programs for the wellness center launch. I heard Deacon Hayes mutter to his wife about how I had always been the difficult child. I heard Sister Margaret click her tongue and whisper that a woman my age should be focused on finding a husband instead of holding grudges against her own blood. They were all participating in the public shaming my parents had orchestrated. They believed my father was performing a righteous act of family discipline by calling me out in front of hundreds of people. They honestly thought I was walking up to that stage to surrender. I reached the bottom of the wooden stairs leading up to the platform. My father Desmond stood at the podium looking down at me with the ultimate patriarchal authority. He wore his status like a heavy cloak. He was a man who demanded absolute submission from the women in his family, but would bend over backward to accommodate the white son-in-law who treated him like a walking bank account. Standing a few feet away from the podium was my mother, Vivian. She was positioned strategically next to Pastor Miller, the most influential man in their social circle. Vivian had her hands clasped in front of her emerald green dress, projecting the image of a long-suffering mother, praying for her wayward daughter to finally see the light. I took the first step up the stairs. The polished wood creaked slightly under my shoes. I looked to the far side of the stage where my sister Bianca and her husband Trent were standing. Bianca was posing with her hand resting delicately on Trent's chest, playing the role of the gracious, forgiving sister. Trent had his arms crossed over his chest. He was rocking back on his heels with a smug, deeply arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He looked at me like I was an unruly employee about to be formally reprimanded. He radiated the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of failing upward on someone else's dime. I reached the center of the stage and stopped right beside my father. The bright spotlight suspended from the vaulted ceiling beat down on my face. The room went completely dead silent. Hundreds of guests held their breath, waiting for the spectacle of my submission. My father covered the microphone with his large hand and leaned in close to my ear. His voice was a harsh, low whisper meant only for me. "Do not embarrass us further, Harper," he warned, his grip tightening on the microphone stand. "You apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law right now. You tell these people you were wrong and you ask for forgiveness. If you do this properly, I will consider letting you back into the family." I looked at him, studying the deep lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples. I wondered when exactly he had traded his dignity for social status. I wondered how he could stand there and demand that his own daughter grovel before a man who was actively destroying our family legacy. I did not answer him. I simply reached out and wrapped my fingers around the sleek metal of the microphone. I pulled it firmly out of his hand. My father looked momentarily startled by the force of my grip, but he stepped back, expecting me to deliver the tearful apology he had scripted for me. I pulled the microphone from the stand and took 2 steps forward, placing myself at the very edge of the stage. I looked out over the massive crowd. I saw the expectant faces of the church elite. I saw my mother clutching Pastor Miller's arm, playing the role of the pious matriarch. I saw Trent trying to hide his victorious grin behind his champagne glass. "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive speakers lining the ballroom walls. "Thank you for giving me this platform today. You are absolutely right about one thing. The Williams family should always prioritize accountability and truth. And since you have generously invited all our friends, our church elders, and our community leaders to witness this moment, I agree that it is time to set the record straight." A murmur rippled through the front rows. My father shifted uneasily behind me. This was not the standard opening of a groveling apology. Exactly 1 year ago, I continued keeping my voice perfectly level and measured. I was asked to make a significant financial contribution to this family. I was asked to take out a second mortgage on my own home, a home I purchased entirely by myself, working 80-hour weeks to drain my own equity, and hand it over to fund a new tech startup. When I asked to see the business plan, I was told that I simply would not understand the complex financial models. I was told to be a supportive sister and blindly hand over my life savings. The ballroom grew uncomfortably quiet. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. People were no longer whispering. They were staring at me with wide eyes hanging onto every single word. When I refused to sign away my financial security, I said, my gaze sweeping slowly across the room, I was labeled a jealous and bitter woman. I was told that I was an embarrassment. My parents demanded that I apologize for protecting my own assets. They told me that if I did not apologize today at my own sister's wellness center launch, I would be permanently cut out of this family. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the silent crowd. I turned my head and looked directly at Trent. His smug smile had completely vanished. His arms were no longer crossed comfortably over his chest. He was staring at me with a look of dawning horror as he realized I was not following the script. So since we are all gathered here today, in the spirit of absolute honesty and accountability, I want to make my position crystal clear, I said, turning back to face the audience. I will not apologize. I will not apologize for refusing to hand over my life savings to a white man using the guise of a startup to drain a black family dry. The room collectively gasped. It was a sharp, loud intake of breath from hundreds of people simultaneously. Someone in the back dropped a glass, and the sound of shattering crystal echoed sharply against the marble floors. Vivian let out a strangled cry and grabbed her chest, looking as though she might actually faint right there next to the pastor. My father lunged forward, reaching for the microphone, but I swiftly stepped out of his reach, keeping my grip firm on the metal handle. I will not apologize for recognizing a parasite when I see one. I continued, my voice rising above the sudden chaotic murmurs filling the room. I will not apologize for refusing to fund a lifestyle built entirely on manipulation and empty buzzwords. And I will certainly not apologize to a man who uses my parents' desperate need for social validation to finance his own failures. That is enough, my father hissed, stepping toward me again, his face twisted with pure rage. Turn that microphone off right now, Harper. You are ruining everything. Before my father could reach me, heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded across the wooden stage. Trent was storming toward me, his face flushed a deep, furious red. The polite, sophisticated facade he maintained for the church crowd had completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had just been backed into a very dangerous corner. He marched right up to me, ignoring the horrified stares of the guests below. "You are completely out of line," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a bitter, jealous little brat, Harper. You have always been insanely jealous of me and Bianca. You could not handle the fact that we are actually successful while you are sweeping floors for a living. You are trying to ruin our launch party because you know you will never achieve anything close to this." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at his shaking finger and then up at his furious, bloodshot eyes. "Is that right, Trent?" I asked, speaking clearly into the microphone so the entire room could hear his impending destruction. "I am jealous of your success. We just closed the deal on this property," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with raw anger. He turned to face the audience, spreading his arms wide, trying to reclaim his narrative. "Bianca and I just closed a deal to buy this entire estate. We are buying Oakwood Estate for $8 million. We are bringing a luxury wellness center to this community and creating real generational wealth. She is just a sad, lonely woman throwing a tantrum because we did not invite her to be part of the investment board." Bianca rushed across the stage to stand beside her husband. She glared at me with absolute hatred, her chest heaving as she tried to project an image of dignified outrage. "She is lying," Bianca cried out to the crowd, pressing her hands to her designer dress. "Harper has always tried to tear us down. She is just trying to embarrass our family because she knows we are buying this mansion today, and she has nothing." The crowd was buzzing now in a state of absolute shock. The church elders were shaking their heads, exchanging bewildered glances. My mother was openly weeping next to the pastor, burying her face in her hands to hide her immense shame. They all desperately wanted to believe Trent and Bianca. They wanted to believe the fairy tale of the wealthy, successful couple building a wellness empire. I looked at Trent. He was breathing heavily, staring at me with a look of desperate defiance. He truly believed he could talk his way out of this. He believed that if he just shouted loud enough and threw enough money around, my parents and their friends would continue to blindly support him. He thought his lies were bulletproof. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I lowered the microphone from my mouth for just a moment. "You should have checked the public registry today, Trent," I said, my voice low and calm. I turned away from him and walked deliberately toward the center of the stage. Behind the podium, there was a massive high-definition projector screen that had been displaying a looping video of Bianca's flawless professional headshots and the glowing gold logo of her fake wellness center. Off to the side of the stage, resting on a small black table, was the audiovisual control laptop running the presentation. I walked straight over to the small black table. My father yelled my name, demanding that I step down from the stage immediately. Bianca screamed at Trent to do something to stop me, but nobody moved fast enough. I reached into the pocket of my tailored navy suit jacket and pulled out a small, sleek silver storage drive. It contained every single heavily guarded financial document I had acquired over the past 48 hours. I held the small silver drive up for just a second, letting the stage lights catch the metal. Then I plugged it directly into the side of the laptop. The heavy silence in the ballroom was shattered by the sharp electronic chime of the laptop recognizing the external drive. The massive high-definition projector screen behind the wooden podium flickered violently. Bianca's glowing, heavily edited face vanished in an instant. The elegant gold logo of the fake wellness center was completely wiped away. In its place, a stark black and white digital document filled the massive screen. It was a scanned copy of a commercial loan agreement from one of the largest banks in Atlanta. The harsh fluorescent white of the document cast a pale, ghostly light over the stage, illuminating the terrified faces of my sister and her husband. I stepped back to the center of the stage and raised the microphone to my lips. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Trent as I spoke. "I told you that you should have checked the public registry today, Trent," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, "because public records tend to reveal the exact things you try so desperately to hide from your investors." I clicked a button on the laptop keyboard, and the document on the screen zoomed in, focusing on the second page of the loan agreement. I had highlighted a specific paragraph in bright yellow digital marker so that even the elderly church members in the very back row could read it perfectly. "You stood up here and told everyone that you and Bianca just closed an $8 million deal to buy Oakwood Estate." I continued pacing slowly across the polished wood of the stage. "You told these good people that you are bringing generational wealth to the Williams family. But this document paints a very different picture." The crowd was completely motionless. Hundreds of wealthy guests and church elders were squinting at the massive screen, reading the heavily highlighted text. I heard someone gasp loudly in the front row. It was Deacon Hayes reading the fine print. "Trent, do you care to explain to the pastor and the ladies here why your $8 million loan is cross-collateralized using my parents' primary residence?" I asked, letting the words ring out clearly through the speakers. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The polite whispers of the church elite turned into a chaotic roar of shock and outrage. The murmurs swelled into a deafening wave of gossip as the reality of the document sank in. My mother, Vivian, let out a sound that was halfway between a scream and a choke. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow under her extravagant church hat. She stumbled backward, grabbing onto the pastor's arm just to keep herself upright. Her entire social standing, her pristine image among the black elite, her years of careful curation, all of it was burning to ashes right in front of her eyes. My father, Desmond, looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. He staggered toward the projector screen, his eyes wide and unblinking, as he stared at his own forged signature and his own property address listed in bold black ink under the collateral section. The booming, authoritative voice he had used to demand my public apology was completely gone. "Trent, what is this?" my father stammered, his voice shaking so badly it barely carried over the noise of the crowd. "What did you do?" Trent was pacing frantically back and forth across the stage, his face sweating profusely under the bright lights. His light gray linen suit was sticking to his back, and his hands were trembling. He pointed a finger at the screen, and then at me, desperately trying to regain control of his shattered narrative. "It is a fake Trent!" yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "She forged that document. She is a bitter, hostile liar trying to ruin our family. Desmond, you know I would never do something like this to you." I clicked the laptop keyboard again. A new document appeared on the screen. It was a highly detailed forensic accounting trail showing exactly how the funds had been routed. It showed the massive balloon payments Trent had missed. It showed the desperate attempts to shuffle money between fake shell companies to cover his catastrophic crypto losses. "It is not a fake, Dad," I said, turning to look at the man who had abandoned me for this fraud. "It is an ironclad, legally binding commercial loan agreement. Trent leveraged your entire life savings and the deed to your house to secure a bridge loan for a wellness center he cannot actually afford. He used your house to buy a stage for his own vanity." Desmond turned slowly to look at Trent. The older man was visibly shaking, now his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "I only signed a character reference," my father said, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound betrayal and rising panic. "You told me it was a standard guarantor form just to show the board that we supported your vision. You told me it was just a formality, Trent. You said my assets were completely protected." Vivian broke away from the pastor and rushed toward the stage, her emerald green dress dragging heavily across the floor. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at her golden son-in-law. Her voice was shrill and completely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. "Tell me this is a lie, Trent," she screamed, her face contorted with terror. "Tell me you did not put our home on the line for this. We worked for 30 years to pay off that house. You promised us we were safe." Bianca was standing frozen near the podium, staring at the screen with wide, blank eyes. The illusion of her luxury life was crashing down around her, and for once she had absolutely nothing to say. She looked at the $10,000 dress she was wearing, and then at the highlighted debt numbers on the screen. She was slowly realizing that her entire empire was built on stolen dirt. The church ladies in the front row were no longer offering prayers or words of encouragement. They were openly shaking their heads, looking at Vivian with profound pity and deep-seated judgment. The social ruin my mother had always feared was finally here, and it had been delivered entirely by the man she had chosen over her own daughter. Trent looked at the trapped faces of my parents and then out at the hostile judging crowd. The polite, sophisticated mask he wore to charm my family finally slipped away completely. The arrogant, entitled core of the man was laid bare for everyone to see. He stopped pacing and let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He ran a hand through his sweaty hair and turned to face my father with absolute, undisguised contempt. "Oh, relax, old man," Trent scoffed, dropping the respectful tone he usually reserved for his father-in-law. "You are making a massive scene over nothing. The business world requires leverage, Desmond. You have to spend money to make money. You think a historic property like Oakwood Estate just falls into your lap for free." "You stole my house," my father roared, taking a threatening step toward Trent. "You lied to my face, and you put my entire life work on the line for your garbage company. I will call the police. I will have you arrested for fraud." Trent rolled his eyes and let out another arrogant bark of laughter. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking at my father like he was nothing more than an annoying insect. "You are not going to do anything," Desmond Trent sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You signed the papers yourself. You were just too stupid to read the fine print before you handed over the pen. And you are not going to call the police, because if you do, this whole family goes down in flames, and Vivian loses her precious spot on the church committee. You are in too deep now. Deep." Trent turned to face the crowd, spreading his arms wide again as if he still owned the room. He looked back at me standing by the laptop and gave me a condescending wink. Besides, Trent continued, his voice loud and aggressively confident. Your little stunt here is completely pointless, Harper. You think you are so smart pulling up these documents, but you are actually way behind the curve. I kept my face perfectly still, letting him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. Go on, Trent, I said quietly. Tell us exactly how smart you are. Trent smirked, turning back to my horrified parents. You do not need to panic, he told them, waving his hand dismissively. The local bank that issued that loan is a joke. They got cold feet when the market dipped last week, and they completely panicked. They already sold that entire debt portfolio to some massive private equity firm up north. My father looked like he was going to be physically sick. You let our house get sold to a private equity firm, he choked out, grasping the edge of the wooden podium for support. Do you know what those companies do, Trent? They will gut us. They will take everything we have and leave us on the street. Trent rolled his eyes again, completely unbothered by my father's terror. Relax, old man. Trent repeated, his voice full of arrogant irritation. You have absolutely no idea how high-level corporate finance works. These private equity firms move slow. They buy up bad debt in bulk and sit on it for years while they restructure their assets. They are not going to foreclose immediately. We have plenty of time to launch the wellness center, secure some new investors, and pay off the minimum interest before they even look at our file. The heavy silence in the ballroom was shattered by the sharp electronic chime of the laptop recognizing the external drive. The massive high-definition projector screen behind the wooden podium flickered violently. Bianca's glowing, heavily edited face vanished in an instant. The elegant gold logo of the fake wellness center was completely wiped away. In its place, a stark black and white digital document filled the massive screen. It was a scanned copy of a commercial loan agreement from one of the largest banks in Atlanta. The harsh fluorescent white of the document cast a pale, ghostly light over the stage, illuminating the terrified faces of my sister and her husband. I stepped back to the center of the stage and raised the microphone to my lips. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Trent as I spoke. I told you that you should have checked the public registry today, Trent, I said, my voice low and calm. Because public records tend to reveal the exact things you try so desperately to hide from your investors. I clicked a button on the laptop keyboard and the document on the screen zoomed in, focusing on the second page of the loan agreement. I had highlighted a specific paragraph in bright yellow digital marker so that even the elderly church members in the very back row could read it perfectly. You stood up here and told everyone that you and Bianca just closed an $8 million deal to buy Oakwood Estate. I continued, pacing slowly across the polished wood of the stage. You told these good people that you are bringing generational wealth to the Williams family. But this document paints a very different picture. The crowd was completely motionless. Hundreds of wealthy guests and church elders were squinting at the massive screen, reading the heavily highlighted text. I heard someone gasp loudly in the front row. It was Deacon Hayes reading the fine print. Trent, do you care to explain to the pastor and the ladies here why your $8 million loan is cross-collateralized using my parents' primary residence? I asked, letting the words ring out clearly through the speakers. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The polite whispers of the church elite turned into a chaotic roar of shock and outrage. The murmurs swelled into a deafening wave of gossip as the reality of the document sank in. My mother, Vivian, let out a sound that was halfway between a scream and a choke. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow under her extravagant church hat. She stumbled backward, grabbing onto the pastor's arm just to keep herself upright. Her entire social standing, her pristine image among the black elite, her years of careful curation, all of it was burning to ashes right in front of her eyes. My father, Desmond, looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. He staggered toward the projector screen, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at his own forged signature and his own property address listed in bold black ink under the collateral section. The booming, authoritative voice he had used to demand my public apology was completely gone. Trent, what is this? my father stammered, his voice shaking so badly it barely carried over the noise of the crowd. What did you do? Trent was pacing frantically back and forth across the stage, his face sweating profusely under the bright lights. His light gray linen suit was sticking to his back, and his hands were trembling. He pointed a finger at the screen and then at me, desperately trying to regain control of his shattered narrative. It is a fake! Trent yelled, his voice cracking with panic. She forged that document. She is a bitter, hostile liar trying to ruin our family. Desmond, you know I would never do something like this to you. I clicked the laptop keyboard again. A new document appeared on the screen. It was a highly detailed forensic accounting trail showing exactly how the funds had been routed. It showed the massive balloon payments Trent had missed. It showed the desperate attempts to shuffle money between fake shell companies to cover his catastrophic crypto losses. It is not a fake, I said, turning to look at the man who had abandoned me for this fraud. It is an ironclad, legally binding commercial loan agreement. Trent leveraged your entire life savings and the deed to your house to secure a bridge loan for a wellness center he cannot actually afford. He used your house to buy a stage for his own vanity. Desmond turned slowly to look at Trent. The older man was visibly shaking now, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. I only signed a character reference, my father said, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound betrayal and rising panic. You told me it was a standard guarantor form just to show the board that we supported your vision. You told me it was just a formality, Trent. You said my assets were completely protected. Vivian broke away from the pastor and rushed toward the stage, her emerald green dress dragging heavily across the floor. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at her golden son-in-law. Her voice was shrill and completely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. Tell me this is a lie, Trent, she screamed, her face contorted with terror. Tell me you did not put our home on the line for this. We worked for 30 years to pay off that house. You promised us we were safe. Bianca was standing frozen near the podium, staring at the screen with wide, blank eyes. The illusion of her luxury life was crashing down around her, and for once she had absolutely nothing to say. She looked at the $10,000 dress she was wearing and then at the highlighted debt numbers on the screen. She was slowly realizing that her entire empire was built on stolen dirt. The church ladies in the front row were no longer offering prayers or words of encouragement. They were openly shaking their heads, looking at Vivian with profound pity and deep-seated judgment. The social ruin my mother had always feared was finally here, and it had been delivered entirely by the man she had chosen over her own daughter. Trent looked at the trapped faces of my parents, and then out at the hostile judging crowd. The polite, sophisticated mask he wore to charm my family finally slipped away completely. The arrogant, entitled core of the man was laid bare for everyone to see. He stopped pacing and let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He ran a hand through his sweaty hair and turned to face my father with absolute, undisguised contempt. "Oh, relax, old man," Trent scoffed, dropping the respectful tone he usually reserved for his father-in-law. "You are making a massive scene over nothing. The business world requires leverage, Desmond. You have to spend money to make money. You think a historic property like Oakwood Estate just falls into your lap for free. You stole my house, my father roared, taking a threatening step toward Trent. You lied to my face, and you put my entire life work on the line for your garbage company. I will call the police. I will have you arrested for fraud. Trent rolled his eyes and let out another arrogant bark of laughter. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking at my father like he was nothing more than an annoying insect. You are not going to do anything, Desmond Trent sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You signed the papers yourself. You were just too stupid to read the fine print before you handed over the pen. And you are not going to call the police because if you do, this whole family goes down in flames and Vivian loses her precious spot on the church committee. You are in too deep now, in too deep. Trent turned to face the crowd, spreading his arms wide again, as if he still owned the room. He looked back at me, standing by the laptop, and gave me a condescending wink. Besides, Trent continued, his voice loud and aggressively confident. Your little stunt here is completely pointless, Harper. You think you are so smart pulling up these documents, but you are actually way behind the curve. I kept my face perfectly still, letting him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. Go on, Trent, I said quietly. Tell us exactly how smart you are. Trent smirked, turning back to my horrified parents. You do not need to panic, he told them, waving his hand dismissively. The local bank that issued that loan is a joke. They got cold feet when the market dipped last week and they completely panicked. They already sold that entire debt portfolio to some massive private equity firm up north. My father looked like he was going to be physically sick. You let our house get sold to a private equity firm, he choked out, grasping the edge of the wooden podium for support. Do you know what those companies do, Trent? They will gut us. They will take everything we have and leave us on the street. Trent rolled his eyes again, completely unbothered by my father's terror. Relax, old man, Trent repeated, his voice full of arrogant irritation. You have absolutely no idea how high-level corporate finance works. These private equity firms move slow. They buy up bad debt in bulk and sit on it for years while they restructure their assets. They are not going to foreclose immediately. We have plenty of time to launch the wellness center, secure some new investors, and pay off the minimum interest before they even look at our file. I let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sigh of pure vindication. I reached out and tapped a single key on the laptop. The massive projector screen shifted one final time. The loan documents vanished completely. In their place, a new massive logo appeared on the screen, replacing the stark black and white text. It was a sleek black crest with the words Obsidian Heritage Private Equity written in bold silver lettering beneath it. I stepped back to the center of the stage and raised the microphone back to my lips, flashing the brightest and most devastating smile of the entire night. That is absolutely correct, Trent, I said, my voice ringing with total absolute authority. The bank sold your toxic garbage to Obsidian Heritage Private Equity. And guess who the founder and chief executive officer is? I let the silence hang in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. My firm specializes in acquiring and preserving historic assets, just like Oakwood Estate. Trent's entire body went rigid. The color vanished from his arrogant face, instantly replaced by the terrifying pale gray of a man realizing he had just stepped off a cliff. He stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He stared at the massive logo on the screen, and then back at me, his mind violently struggling to process the reality of his own destruction. Bianca let out a loud, shrill sound of pure denial. She shook her head frantically, her expensive diamond necklace rattling against her chest. She is lying, Bianca screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. Harper does not have that kind of money. She is just a student. She lives in a tiny condo. Trent, tell them she is lying. Tell them this is just another one of her jealous tricks. But Trent could not speak. He was staring at the digital documents cycling on the screen behind me. The screen was now displaying the exact corporate registration forms for Obsidian Heritage, with my name listed clearly at the very top. I had built my empire in total silence while they were busy spending money. They did not have to impress people who did not care about them. I had spent the last 5 years turning my historic preservation background into a highly lucrative private equity firm. I bought distressed historic properties, rehabilitated them, and turned them into massive generational wealth. My father, Desmond, looked like he was suffocating inside his custom-tailored suit. He stared at the screen and then looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "You bought the debt?" he whispered, his voice breaking over the microphone that I still held near his face. "You own the loan on my house, Harper. I own every single asset attached to this fraudulent portfolio," I confirmed, looking down at the crowd of church elders who were now watching the ultimate destruction of the Williams family dynasty. "But the debt on your primary residence is actually the least of Trent's problems today." I turned my sights back to the sweating, shaking man clinging to the podium. "Today is a very special day," I announced, my voice carrying a sharp, dangerous edge. "Today is not just the day I get my master's degree. Today is May 15th. You all thought I wanted you to celebrate this specific date just because it was the day I received my diploma. You thought my graduation was the only thing happening in my life. But my graduation ceremony was always just a pleasant coincidence." I took another step toward Trent, forcing him to look me in the eye. Today is May 15th. I repeated slowly, letting every single syllable land like a physical blow, which makes today the absolute final day of the grace period before the bank officially forecloses on my parents' home and throws Trent in federal prison for financial wire fraud. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Vivian was gripping the edge of the stage, her knuckles turning stark white. The church ladies in the front row were clutching their purses, their mouths hanging open in absolute shock. They were witnessing the spectacular downfall of the most arrogant man in their social circle. "You did not just take out a bad loan, Trent," I said, projecting my voice so every single guest could hear the undeniable truth. "You actively engaged in federal financial crimes. You forged secondary signatures and inflated the collateral appraisals, using fake shell companies to secure $8 million across state lines. And as the new owner of your debt portfolio, I am legally obligated to report those findings to the federal authorities the second the grace period ends." Trent let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He looked at Bianca, but she was backing away from him, her hands covering her mouth in sheer horror. She was finally realizing that her $10,000 dress and her lavish launch party were funded by federal crimes that could send her husband to prison for decades. The golden child was watching her entire fake empire burn to ashes. My mother. Vivian suddenly stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect expensive makeup. "Harper, please," she begged, her voice trembling with raw desperation. She was no longer the proud church matriarch demanding a public apology. She was a terrified woman staring down the barrel of total social and financial ruin. "Please, Harper, you cannot do this to your family. We will lose our home. We will lose everything we worked for. You have to sign an extension on the debt. You have to give us time to fix this." I looked at the woman who had abandoned me at a graduation staging area just hours earlier because I refused to bow down to her golden child. I remembered the cold text message she had sent telling me that no apology meant no family. I remembered the years of subtle insults, the constant comparison, the absolute lack of any maternal warmth or protection. I raised my left arm and slowly, deliberately checked my watch. The gold dial caught the bright stage lights, reflecting a sharp gleam across the platform. I looked back up at my parents. My father was breathing heavily, leaning heavily against the podium, while my mother stood frozen, waiting for my response. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You stood in your driveway this morning and decided that you would not come to my graduation unless I publicly apologized for protecting myself. You demanded that I get on my knees and make amends to a criminal. You drew your line in the sand, and you told me that without an apology, we were no longer a family." I let a heavy silence hang in the air for 5 full seconds. I looked at the digital clock displayed on the bottom corner of the projector screen behind me. "What a fascinating coincidence," I said, lowering the microphone slightly. "Because I have a demand of my own today. I will not sign any debt extension papers. I will not halt the foreclosure process, and I will not bury the evidence of Trent's federal wire fraud. I will initiate the absolute destruction of everything you hold dear unless you do exactly what I say." My parents stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for my ultimatum. The church crowd watched in stunned silence as the rejected daughter completely inverted the power dynamics of the entire Williams family. "I will not sign the debt extension papers unless you pack your bags and vacate that house," I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "You will drive back to that house, the one you foolishly allowed this parasite to steal from you, and you will leave the keys on the kitchen counter. If you want any chance of me showing even a fraction of mercy regarding your primary residence, you will be permanently off the premises by 5 o'clock. I looked at my watch one final time, then stared directly into my mother's weeping eyes. "It is currently 4:45 in the afternoon," I stated coldly. "I suggest you start running." Vivian stood completely still for a fraction of a second as the absolute reality of my words washed over her. The silence in the ballroom was so profound that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning units above us. Everyone was waiting to see what the matriarch of the Williams family would do now that her entire world was collapsing around her. Vivian slowly turned her head to look at Trent. The man who was supposed to be her golden ticket to the absolute top of Atlanta society was standing there dripping with sweat and looking like a cornered animal. He tried to offer her a weak, reassuring smile, but his face was trembling. Vivian let out a sound that was something between a broken sob and a vicious animal growl. She lunged forward with surprising speed. She raised her right hand and brought it across Trent's face with a sickeningly loud smack. The sound of the slap echoed through the massive vaulted ceilings of the ballroom, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Trent stumbled backward, grabbing his rapidly reddening cheek, but he did not dare retaliate or even defend himself. He knew he was completely exposed and utterly powerless in front of the people he had spent years trying to impress. But Vivian could never hold the actual abuser accountable for long. Her entire identity was built on protecting the illusion of her perfect family. She immediately spun around and locked her furious, tear-filled eyes onto me. The brief moment of clarity she had experienced was quickly swallowed by her need to find a convenient scapegoat. "You are a monster, Harper!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet room and making the church elders in the front row flinch. "You dare stand on this stage and threaten to foreclose on your own ancestors' home. That house is our legacy. Big Mama would curse you from her grave for destroying what she worked so hard to preserve. She would be absolutely ashamed of the vindictive, horrible woman you have become today." I did not back away from her rage. I did not shrink down the way I used to when I was a child, terrified of her booming voice. Instead, I reached inside the interior pocket of my tailored navy suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the thick, textured paper of an aged sealed envelope. I pulled it out and held it up for Vivian to see. The paper was yellowed with age, and the elegant faded handwriting on the front was unmistakably that of my great-grandmother. Big Mama was the only person in this family who ever saw me clearly. I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and cold, and she was the only person who saw exactly what you and Desmond were becoming. I walked slowly across the stage, making sure the church elders in the front row could hear every single syllable of the truth. "You think Big Mama did not know that you and Dad were blindly obsessed with status?" I asked, my eyes fixed on my mother's crumbling facade. "She knew exactly who you were, Vivian. She knew that you would eventually sell out her entire legacy just to fund Bianca's fake lifestyle and keep up appearances for people who do not even care about you. Big Mama gave me this letter before she died because she knew I would be the only one strong enough to protect our real heritage from your relentless greed." My father Desmond let out a weak protesting noise, but he lacked the strength to actually speak. He was leaning heavily against the wooden podium, looking like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. I pointed to the massive crystal chandeliers and the ornate crown molding of the ballroom around us, sweeping my arm to encompass the entire estate. "You have been walking around this estate all afternoon, bragging to your church friends about how your golden child is buying a historic mansion?" I continued, my voice ringing through the speakers. "But you have absolutely no idea what this building actually represents. You never bothered to learn the history of your own bloodline because you were too busy trying to buy your way into elite circles." The church ladies leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. Deacon Hayes whispered something to his wife, pointing at the screen that still displayed my private equity firm logo. "This Oakwood estate is not just some random piece of luxury real estate," I announced, making sure every person in the room understood the gravity of the moment. "This is actually the property our great-great-grandfather built with his own 2 hands. He laid the foundation for this estate before it was unjustly stripped from him by corrupt local officials and racist banking policies." Big Mama knew this truth, and she told me the story when I was just a little girl. "She knew that our blood belonged in these halls long before you decided to rent it out for a fake wellness center." Vivian and Desmond turned ghostly pale. The realization of what they had nearly lost through their own sheer ignorance was finally breaking through their denial. They had signed away their primary residence to fund a man who was actively desecrating their own ancestral lands. I turned my sights back to Trent, who was currently trying to slowly edge his way off the back of the stage while everyone was focused on me. "Not so fast, Trent," I said, stopping him dead in his tracks. "We have not even gotten to the best part of your little business venture yet. Vivian and Desmond need to know exactly how much of a fraud you really are." Trent froze his shoulders, slumping in defeat, as the spotlight hit his sweaty face. I looked at my parents, who were clinging to each other in absolute despair. Trent never bought this mansion, I told them, letting the absolute finality of the truth crush their remaining hopes. He never even submitted a bid for Oakwood Estate. Bianca shook her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. She grabbed her heavy diamond necklace as if it could somehow anchor her to the wealthy reality she thought she lived in. "No," she cried, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "We signed the papers, Harper. I saw the contracts. We own this building. We are the new owners of Oakwood Estate." "You saw forged documents," Bianca, I told her without a single ounce of pity in my heart. "Trent used the $8 million mortgage money he stole from your parents' house to pay off his massive crypto gambling debts. He was drowning in toxic offshore loans, and the lenders were threatening to ruin him if he did not pay up immediately. He forged the Oakwood purchase papers just to show off to you and to keep Desmond handing over more blank checks. He never intended to buy a wellness center. He just needed a temporary stage to play a rich man before he skipped town and left you all holding the massive bag of federal debt." Desmond let out a guttural scream of pure agony. He pushed himself off the podium and lunged at Trent, his hands reaching out to strangle the man who had destroyed his life. Trent shrieked and scrambled backward, tripping over a microphone cord and falling hard onto the wooden floor of the stage. Several deacons rushed up the stairs to hold my father back, pulling him away as he sobbed and cursed at the pathetic man cowering on the ground. Bianca dropped to her knees on the stage, ruining her $10,000 designer dress. She stared at Trent with absolute horror, finally realizing that she was married to a broke criminal and that her entire identity as a wealthy, successful business owner was a complete lie. She covered her face and began to wail loudly, her cries echoing pitifully through the grand ballroom. The church elite were now in a state of total frenzy. Sister Margaret was openly gossiping with the women next to her, pointing at Vivian and shaking her head in disgust. The social ruin was absolute and irreversible. The Williams family name was now permanently associated with fraud, delusion, and public humiliation. "But he made one critical mistake," I continued, my voice easily cutting through the chaos of the stage. "When he started forging property deeds, he used the public registry systems that my firm monitors every single day. I saw the fraudulent filings immediately. I watched him try to leverage my family history for his own survival. I watched him try to use my great-great-grandfather's stolen legacy as a prop for his fake wellness empire." I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at the crowd and then back at my broken family. So I stepped in. "I bought Oakwood Estate last month. I paid in cash through Obsidian Heritage Private Equity. I legally acquired the property to return it to our family's true bloodline where it belongs. I did what none of you were capable of doing because you were too busy worshipping a false idol." Vivian fell to her knees beside Bianca, weeping uncontrollably. She reached a shaking hand out toward me, her eyes begging for a mercy she had never once shown me. "Harper, please," she sobbed, her voice weak and ragged. "We are your family. You cannot throw us out on the street. We have nowhere to go. Please forgive us." I looked down at the women who had made my life a living hell for decades. I felt no guilt. I felt no hesitation. I felt only the cleansing, absolute power of the truth. I raised my left wrist and tapped the glass face of my watch. "It is currently 4:50 in the afternoon," I stated coldly, my voice ringing with total authority. "The bank forecloses at 5. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack whatever dignity you have left and vacate my property." I walked down the wooden stairs and headed straight toward the grand double doors. The crowd parted for me in absolute silence, offering no resistance, as the true owner of Oakwood Estate finally claimed her rightful place. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations and their toxic, conditional love had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the disappointment they tried to hide in the shadows. I was the architect of my own destiny, and the protector of my ancestors' true legacy. Behind me, the sounds of absolute despair continued to echo through the grand ballroom. My father Desmond was still struggling against the deacons who were holding him back, his face purple with rage and regret. He was shouting about his retirement accounts and his lost reputation, but his words were drowned out by the sheer volume of gossip rippling through the church congregation. The very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress were now the architects of his social demise. They would talk about this day for decades to come, spinning tales of the arrogant patriarch who lost everything because he trusted a fraudulent son-in-law over his own brilliant daughter. Vivian and Bianca remained on the floor of the stage, a tragic portrait of shattered delusions. Bianca was clutching her diamond necklace as if hoping it would magically transport her back to a reality where she was still the golden child. But the diamonds were likely bought on credit just like everything else in her fake empire. Vivian was staring blankly at the massive projector screen, where the Obsidian Heritage logo continued to glow bright and unyielding. The reality that her youngest daughter, the one she had called a high-end janitor, was now a billionaire private equity chief executive officer was simply too much for her fragile ego to process. Her mind had completely short-circuited under the weight of her own massive failures. Trent was still cowering near the podium, trying to make himself as small as possible. He knew that the moment he stepped off that stage, he would be facing federal agents and a mountain of undeniable criminal charges. His crypto gambling days were permanently over. There would be no more expensive wine paid for by my father, and no more condescending remarks directed at my career. He was heading straight to a federal penitentiary, and he would have a very long time to think about the terrible mistake he made when he tried to cross Harper Williams. I reached the heavy double doors at the entrance of the ballroom. I did not look back. I did not need to see their faces one last time to know that I had won. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the warm, fading sunlight of the Atlanta afternoon. The valet saw me approaching and immediately rushed to retrieve my sleek black luxury sedan. He opened the door for me with a respectful nod, completely unaware of the absolute devastation I had just unleashed inside the historic mansion. I slid into the comfortable leather driver's seat and started the engine. The low, powerful purr of the car matched the steady, confident beating of my own heart. I pulled out of the Oakwood Estate driveway, driving past the towering iron gates and the massive ancient oak trees that my great-great-grandfather had planted so many generations ago. The property was finally safe. The legacy was finally secure. I reached into my pocket and touched the aged sealed envelope one last time, thanking Big Mama for her wisdom and her unwavering belief in my potential. She had known that the truth would eventually come to light. She had known that the bloodline would correct itself and that the rightful heir would return to claim what was stolen. As I drove down the winding tree-lined road, I glanced at the digital clock on my dashboard. It read exactly 5 o'clock. The grace period was officially over. The foreclosures were locked in, and the federal authorities were likely already moving to secure Trent's assets. The old Williams family dynamic was completely dead and buried. I merged onto the highway, heading back toward the city and the massive corporate office where my real team was waiting to celebrate my graduation and my latest historic acquisition. I rolled down the window, letting the fresh evening breeze wash over my face. I had a massive empire to run, and a beautiful historic estate to preserve. The future was entirely mine, and it was going to be absolutely magnificent. Trent stared at the massive projector screen displaying the deed to Oakwood Estate with my name on it. The arrogant smirk that had lived on his face for years melted away into a mask of pure, feral panic. He looked at the forensic accounting documents detailing his federal wire fraud and the forged bank loans. He finally realized that his entire fake empire was completely destroyed, and there was no smooth talking his way out of this trap. He was backed into a corner with hundreds of church elders and wealthy socialites watching his demise. Trent let out a vicious string of curses that made the church ladies in the front row cover their ears in horror. His polite, sophisticated facade shattered completely. He looked around the stage like a trapped rat searching for an exit. Bianca reached out to him, her hands shaking as she grabbed the sleeve of his gray linen suit. She was crying hysterically, begging him to tell her that I was lying and that their luxury wellness center was still real. Trent did not offer her a single word of comfort. He let out another furious curse and violently shoved Bianca away from him. He pushed her so hard that she lost her footing and collapsed onto the hard wooden floor of the stage, her $10,000 designer dress tearing as she fell. Vivian let out a piercing scream, seeing her golden daughter thrown to the ground by the man she had worshipped. Trent did not even look back. He leaped off the edge of the stage, bypassing the stairs entirely. He hit the marble floor of the ballroom and started sprinting down the center aisle. He shoved past the shocked guests, knocking over a tray of expensive champagne flutes. He was making a desperate run for the grand double doors at the back of the estate, hoping to disappear into the Atlanta night before the reality of his financial crimes caught up to him. But he was already entirely out of time. Before Trent could even reach the halfway point of the aisle, the deafening wail of police sirens pierced the quiet evening air. The sound grew louder and more aggressive, echoing off the historic stone walls of the mansion. Bright red and blue police lights began flashing violently outside, illuminating the massive stained glass windows and casting harsh, colorful shadows across the terrified faces of the congregation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a massive crash. Trent skidded to a halt, his expensive leather shoes sliding on the polished marble. He was completely blocked. Walking through the doors was my lead corporate attorney, Elise. She was a razor-sharp black woman who radiated absolute authority and ruthless intelligence. She wore a flawless tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase containing every single piece of evidence we had compiled against Trent over the last 48 hours. She stepped into the ballroom looking at the chaos with a calm, cold expression of total control. Flanking her on both sides were 6 federal financial crime detectives wearing dark windbreakers with the agency letters printed boldly in yellow across their backs. They moved into the room with practiced military precision, completely ignoring the gasps and screams of the wealthy guests. "That is him," Elise said, her voice cutting through the noise of the ballroom like a knife. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Trent, who was frozen in the middle of the aisle. "He is a flight risk." The detective surged forward. Trent let out a pathetic, panicked yell and tried to turn back toward the stage, but there was nowhere left to run. 2 heavy-set detectives tackled him, taking him down right in the middle of the aisle. The polite, sophisticated son-in-law, who had looked down on me for years, was now pressed face first against the marble floor, his gray linen suit ruined. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom as they locked his wrists firmly behind his back. The church congregation erupted into absolute pandemonium. Deacon Hayes grabbed his chest and had to be guided to a chair. Sister Margaret clutched her pearl necklace and openly wept at the sheer scandal of it all. Pastor Miller stood at the front of the room, completely speechless, watching the man he had just blessed for a luxury wellness center being dragged to his feet by federal agents. Trent was breathing heavily, his face red and covered in sweat. He looked like a cornered animal as the detectives began reading him his rights, detailing the multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and real estate forgery. He looked over his shoulder, trying to find my parents in the crowd, but they were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. Bianca scrambled up from the floor of the stage, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess around her face. She ran down the wooden stairs, tripping over the hem of her ruined dress. She sprinted down the aisle, ignoring the stares of the church members, and threw herself at my feet. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my navy suit. "Harper, please," she wailed, her voice breaking into a hysterical screech. "You cannot let them take him away. He is my husband. We are supposed to build an empire together. Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you will drop the charges. I will lose my house. I will lose my cars. I will have absolutely nothing left. You cannot do this to your own sister." I looked down at the woman who had spent her entire life tearing me down just to make herself feel taller. I looked at the hands that had gladly accepted the stolen equity from my parents' house to fund a fake life of luxury. I slowly reached down and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one, pushing her away with absolute disgust. I cannot drop federal charges, Bianca, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any pity. The bank was the victim of his wire fraud, and the federal government is prosecuting him for forging corporate documents across state lines. He dug his own grave, and you happily danced on the dirt. You are going to lose everything because you built your entire life on a foundation of lies and stolen money. Before Bianca could let out another scream, a heavy thud echoed near the front of the aisle. My father, Desmond, had stumbled down the stairs from the stage. His face was a terrifying shade of pale gray, and he was clutching the left side of his chest with both hands. For a moment, I thought the sheer shock of the scandal had actually triggered a heart attack. He dropped heavily to his knees right in front of the entire church congregation. The ultimate patriarch. The man who demanded absolute submission from the women in his family. The man who had abandoned his own daughter to protect his social standing was now groveling on the marble floor. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with absolute terror. "Harper," my father pleaded, his voice a broken, pathetic croak. "Please, Harper, you have to stop this. You are a billionaire now. You have the money. You can pay off the bank. You can pay the private equity firm. You can hire the best lawyers in the country and bail him out. You have to save us from this." I stared down at the man who had called me a jealous, bitter woman just hours earlier. I stared at the man who had demanded that I get on my knees and apologize to a criminal to save his precious ego. Why would I ever do that? I asked, my voice echoing through the massive vaulted ceilings of my new property. Why would I spend a single cent of my hard-earned money to save a man who stole your home and tried to destroy my life? "You have to save the family honor!" Desmond cried out, tears finally spilling over his graying eyelashes and streaming down his cheeks. He gestured wildly around the ballroom at the staring, judging faces of the church elite. "Look at these people, Harper. They are watching us. We will be a laughingstock. The Williams name will be completely ruined in Atlanta. You have to use your money to fix this, to protect our legacy. Please, I am begging you as your father, save our honor." I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the gossiping church ladies, the stunned pastor, and the terrified, wealthy guests. I looked at my mother, Vivian, who was still frozen on the stage, too ashamed to even step down and face the crowd. Then I looked back down at my father, kneeling at my feet. "The Williams family honor died the day you tried to force me to hand over my life savings to a con artist," I told him, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "It died the day you told me I was no longer your daughter because I refused to be scammed. You chose your precious social status over my safety, and now you have absolutely nothing left." I stepped around his kneeling form and signaled to Elise, my attorney. She nodded sharply and instructed the detectives to move. They pulled Trent forward, marching the struggling, disgraced golden boy down the aisle toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting outside the grand double doors. "You do not have a legacy, Desmond," I said, looking over my shoulder one last time. "You have a massive mountain of debt and a son-in-law heading to federal prison, and you have exactly 8 minutes left to pack your bags and get off my property before I have you escorted out for trespassing." I turned my back on the weeping, ruined remains of my family and walked out of the ballroom, following my attorney into the cool evening air. The massive, historic doors of Oakwood Estate closed firmly behind me, shutting away the toxic past and leaving them alone in the dark with the absolute destruction they had brought upon themselves. I stood under the towering columns of the grand entrance, breathing in the crisp evening air, but my departure was immediately interrupted. The heavy wooden doors behind me burst open with a violent crash that echoed across the stone portico. Bianca stumbled out onto the front steps, her $10,000 designer dress torn at the hem and covered in dust from the ballroom floor. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess, and her expensive makeup was running down her face in thick black streaks. Vivian and Desmond spilled out right behind her, looking like two ghosts who had just watched their entire universe collapse. They had followed me out into the evening light, completely unwilling to accept that their reign of terror was finally finished. Bianca let out a feral screech and lunged toward me, her arms outstretched as if she was going to physically attack me. My private security team reacted instantly. 2 massive men in dark suits stepped smoothly into her path, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between me and my hysterical sister. Bianca crashed into them and bounced off, collapsing onto the cold, hard stone of the front steps. She began weeping with a raw, ugly intensity that completely erased her carefully curated pageant queen persona. "Harper, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her sudden poverty. "You have to fix this. You have to tell them it was all a mistake. You have all this money now. You can make the federal charges go away. You can pay the bank and clear his debt. We are your blood. We are sisters, Harper. You cannot let them take my husband away." I stood perfectly still, looking down at her writhing form on the ground. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, and there was no remorse. I shifted my gaze to my parents, who were hovering nervously behind her. Desmond was still rubbing the left side of his chest, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the proud, domineering patriarch he had been just an hour ago. The reality of his absolute financial ruin was slowly crushing the life out of him. He looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes, completely forgetting how he had screamed at me to get off his stage and obey his commands. "Harper." My father rasped, his breathing shallow and dangerously erratic. "Your sister is right. You have to use your vast resources to clean this up. You have to bail Trent out of federal custody. You have to save the family honor. We will be a complete laughingstock in the church. The elders are already talking about us inside. You cannot let the Williams family name go down in history like this. You owe it to us to fix this mess." I let out a sound that was completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. It was a cold, harsh laugh that made my father flinch. "You never cared about my honor," I said, my voice slicing through the quiet evening air like a sharpened blade. "You only cared about your own fragile image. You only cared about looking wealthy and successful to a room full of people who do not even actually like you. You sat by and watched Trent humiliate me for years. You actively participated in my degradation. You demanded that I get on my knees and apologize to a convicted con artist just to keep up your precious social appearances." I took a step closer to the security guards, locking eyes with my ruined father. "The humiliation you feel today was not caused by me," I told him, projecting my voice so the truth would hit him with maximum force. "It was caused entirely by your own greedy choices. You built a pathetic house of cards on a foundation of lies and stolen money. And now you are angry at me because the wind finally blew it all down. You sold your soul to a criminal and you expected me to foot the bill." Before my father could try to formulate another pathetic excuse, a man in a sharp black suit stepped out from the main hall. It was Mr. Sterling, the head estate manager of Oakwood. He held a sleek silver tablet in his hands, and he looked completely unbothered by the dramatic weeping happening on his front steps. He was a professional who had seen it all, and he had absolutely no time for my family's theatrics. He walked directly past my parents and stopped in front of Bianca, looking down at her with cold, professional disdain. "Excuse me, Mrs. Carlyle," he said, his voice crisp and polite, but carrying a distinct edge of corporate ruthlessness. "The local authorities have informed us that your launch party is officially terminated due to the federal arrest of your husband. Since the event has exceeded the contracted time limit and involved unforeseen violent disruptions, I need to collect the immediate overtime fees. I also need to collect the damages deposit for the crystal champagne glasses your husband destroyed while attempting to flee the premises." Bianca stared up at him blankly, her tear-streaked face twisting in genuine confusion. She wiped her running nose with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of mascara across her cheek. "What are you talking about?" she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "Trent handles all the event finances. Trent has the corporate cards for the wellness center. I do not deal with the vendors." Mr. Sterling did not flinch or offer a single ounce of sympathy. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at his silver tablet. "The corporate cards attached to your wellness center account were just declined by our processing bank," he informed her smoothly. "In fact, the federal authorities have already frozen every single financial account associated with your husband's businesses. We require an alternate form of payment immediately, or we will be forced to pursue civil action against you personally for the outstanding balance of $12,000. Vivian gasped loudly, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had been physically struck by a heavy stone. Bianca panicked. She scrambled to a sitting position and frantically dug into her small designer clutch, pulling out a thick stack of personal credit cards. She handed a heavy gold card to Mr. Sterling with a violently shaking hand. He swiped it through the card reader attached to his tablet. It beeped a harsh red error. "Declined," he said flatly, his face completely blank. Bianca let out a panicked squeak and handed him a platinum card. He swiped it again without changing his expression. "Declined," he repeated, the red light flashing brightly in the evening shadows. She shoved 3 more cards at him, her breathing turning into shallow, hyperventilating gasps. She was begging the machine to work, praying for a miracle. Every single one of them beeped red. Every single one of them declined. The banks had already frozen everything connected to Trent's fraudulent accounts, and Bianca's personal accounts were completely drained. She had absolutely no emergency savings of her own because she spent every single dollar trying to look like a millionaire on social media. She had absolutely nothing left in the world. The golden child who had mocked my career and told me I was sweeping floors for a living was now completely broke, sitting in the dirt on the steps of my historic mansion, unable to pay a basic catering bill. She had lived her entire adult life purely off Trent's fraudulent schemes and my parents' desperate financial handouts. Now the well was completely dry, and she was utterly penniless. Vivian watched her favorite daughter break down into a sobbing, hyperventilating mess on the stone stairs. The reality of their absolute destitution was finally crashing down on her carefully styled head. They had no money to bail Trent out of federal prison. They had no money to pay the estate manager for the ruined party. They had no social standing left to protect among their elite church friends. And because of Trent's forged loan documents, they no longer even had a roof over their own heads. My mother let out a horrific wailing sound. It was the sound of a vain, arrogant woman watching her entire identity burn to the ground in a matter of minutes. She fell heavily to her knees right beside Bianca, her extravagant green church hat falling off her head and rolling across the dusty brick portico. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, entirely abandoning her lifelong pride. Several wealthy church elders were slowly filtering out of the mansion, standing in absolute shock as they watched the great Vivian Williams crawling on the dirty ground like a beggar. She did not care who saw her anymore. She was gripped by pure, primal terror. "Harper, please!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the sprawling, manicured lawns of Oakwood Estate. "Please, Harper, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not take our home away from us. We have nowhere else to go. We will do anything you want. We will apologize to you in front of the whole church congregation. We will tell everyone that Trent lied to us and manipulated our trust. Just let us stay in our old house. You have the deed now. You own the debt portfolio. Please let us stay." "I cannot be a homeless woman, Harper. I am your own mother." I looked down at the pathetic woman kneeling at my feet. I thought about the years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the way she had actively tried to destroy my confidence so Bianca could shine brighter in the spotlight. I thought about how quickly she had been willing to throw me away just a few hours ago, when she believed Trent was the real millionaire and I was just a jealous failure. I thought about how she had tried to force me to give my hard-earned life savings to a criminal just so she could brag to her friends about a fake wellness center. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to her, looking down at her tear-soaked face with eyes as cold and hard as obsidian. "You stopped being my mother the day you told me I was an embarrassment for refusing to fund this massive fraud," I said, my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for every single lingering church member to hear clearly. "You chose to protect a cheap illusion instead of your own daughter. You blindly handed over the deed to your historic house because you were greedy and you wanted the unearned social glory of a fake wellness center. You sold out Big Mama's precious legacy for a handful of empty promises and a cheap moment in the spotlight." Vivian sobbed loudly, pressing her manicured hands together in a desperate pleading gesture. "Please, Harper," she wailed over and over again, rocking back and forth on her knees in the dust. "Please do not do this to us. I am not going to let you stay in a house that you willingly threw away to a criminal," I told her, delivering my final, absolute ultimatum without a single trace of hesitation or regret. You wanted to live the high life on stolen money, and now you get to face the devastating consequences of your own bottomless greed. The foreclosure stands exactly as the legal contract dictates. You will drive back to that house right now, you will pack your bags, and you will completely vacate the premises by 5 o'clock today. I paused, letting the absolute finality of my words crush whatever tiny fraction of hope she still had left in her dark heart. If there is a single piece of furniture or a single person left inside that house at 501, I will have my private security team physically remove it to the curb, and I will have you both immediately arrested for trespassing, I stated, my tone leaving zero room for negotiation or debate. I turned my back on the weeping, ruined remains of my family and walked out of the ballroom, following my attorney into the cool evening air. The massive historic doors of Oakwood Estate closed firmly behind me, shutting away the toxic past and leaving them alone in the dark with the absolute destruction they had brought upon themselves. I stood under the towering columns of the grand entrance, breathing in the crisp evening air, but my departure was immediately interrupted. The heavy wooden doors behind me burst open with a violent crash that echoed across the stone portico. Bianca stumbled out onto the front steps, her $10,000 designer dress torn at the hem and covered in dust from the ballroom floor. Vivian and Desmond spilled out right behind her, looking like two ghosts who had just watched their entire universe collapse. Bianca let out a feral screech and lunged toward me, but my private security team reacted instantly, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between us. She bounced off, collapsing onto the cold, hard stone of the front steps, weeping with a raw, ugly intensity. "Harper, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "You have to fix this. You have all this money now. We are your blood." I stood perfectly still, looking down at her writhing form on the ground. I felt absolutely nothing. I shifted my gaze to my father, who was clutching his chest. "Harper," my father rasped, "you have to save the family honor. You owe it to us to fix this mess." "You never cared about my honor," I said, my voice slicing through the quiet evening air like a sharpened blade. "You only cared about looking wealthy and successful. You sold your soul to a criminal, and you expected me to foot the bill." Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors swung open wider, and Pastor Miller stepped out onto the portico. His face was a mask of righteous fury, and his deep voice silenced the murmuring crowd instantly. He walked down the stone steps and stopped right in front of my father. "Desmond Williams." The pastor boomed, his voice carrying effortlessly. "You have brought a den of thieves into my congregation. Effective immediately, you are permanently removed from the church board of directors. You are stripped of your title as elder, and your family is no longer welcome in our sanctuary. May the Lord have mercy on your soul, because this congregation will not." The pastor turned his back and walked away, leaving Desmond to completely collapse against the stone pillar. Before the dust could even settle, a man in a sharp black suit stepped out from the main hall. It was Mr. Sterling, the head estate manager of Oakwood. He walked directly past my parents and stopped in front of Bianca, looking down at her with cold, professional disdain. "Excuse me, Mrs. Carlyle," he said. "The local authorities have informed us that your launch party is officially terminated. I need to collect the immediate overtime and hazard fees for the damages your husband caused. $12,000. Bianca panicked, frantically digging into her small designer clutch, pulling out a thick stack of personal credit cards. She handed a heavy gold card to Mr. Sterling. "Declined," he said flatly. She shoved 3 more cards at him. Every single one of them beeped red. The banks had already frozen everything connected to Trent's fraudulent accounts. She had absolutely nothing left in the world. Vivian watched her favorite daughter break down into a sobbing, hyperventilating mess on the stone stairs. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, entirely abandoning her lifelong pride. "Harper, please," she screamed. "Please do not do this to us." Elise stepped out from the shadows of the portico, walking purposefully toward me with a sleek silver pen and a thick manila folder in her hands. She stopped right in front of my parents, her posture radiating total corporate dominance. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," Elise said, her voice completely cold and professional. "As the legal representative for Obsidian Heritage Private Equity, I am officially serving you with these final foreclosure documents. You no longer hold any legal claim whatsoever to the property you used as collateral. The deed belongs exclusively to my client." Bianca stared up at Elise, her face a mask of ruined makeup and pure terror. "What is going to happen to our house?" Bianca whispered. "It is our legacy." I stepped forward, taking the silver pen from Elise and signing the final pages of the document with a smooth, confident stroke. "I am not selling the house, Bianca," I told her, my voice echoing clearly across the dark portico. "I am going to tear it down to the ground." The silence that followed my words was absolute. "The house will be completely demolished next month," I announced, letting the words sink deep into their fragile egos. "And in its place, Obsidian Heritage is fully funding the construction of a state-of-the-art, subsidized housing foundation. It will be a safe haven built specifically for single Black mothers who need real support to get back on their feet." I turned my back on them, feeling the heavy, toxic chains of my childhood completely fall away from my shoulders forever. I took a deep breath of the crisp Atlanta air, feeling more powerful and grounded than I had ever felt in my entire life. I began walking back toward my luxury sedan, the heavy historic doors of Oakwood Estate standing tall and proud in the background. I was ready to leave this nightmare behind and step fully into my own magnificent future. But as my hand touched the cold metal of the car door handle, a desperate, agonizing scream tore through the night air. "Harper, please." Vivian screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, sobbing wail that carried across the empty, dark lawns. "I am still your mother." I did not turn around immediately. I let the heavy silence hang in the air, letting her desperate words fade into the cool evening breeze. I slowly turned my head, looking over my shoulder at the pathetic woman who had spent my entire life tearing me down. "You lost the right to call yourself my mother," I said, my voice perfectly steady and piercing through the quiet night. "You lost that right the exact moment you chose to leave 4 empty seats at my graduation today. You chose to celebrate a fake party over my real achievement. You chose to worship a criminal instead of supporting your own daughter. You are nothing to me now." Vivian let out a choked gasp, dropping her face into her hands as the absolute reality of her consequences finally shattered her delusion. I opened the heavy door of my luxury sedan and slid into the crisp leather interior, shutting the door firmly on her hysterical sobs. I started the engine, the powerful roar of the motor completely drowning out the sound of my family weeping on the stone steps of my property. As I pulled away from the grand portico, I watched them in the rearview mirror, shrinking into tiny, insignificant shadows against the massive pillars of the historic mansion. They were finally exactly where they belonged, entirely in the past. I drove down the long, winding driveway of Oakwood Estate, watching the towering, ancient oak trees pass by my windows. The property was legally mine, and its future was going to be absolutely beautiful. I drove through the massive iron gates as they closed automatically behind me, sealing the estate and locking my toxic family out of my life forever. I turned onto the main highway, heading back toward the glowing city skyline. The sunset was absolutely breathtaking, painting the Atlanta sky in brilliant strokes of crushed violet, burning gold, and deep crimson. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, vibrating with a new message. I glanced over and saw a notification from Mr. Harrison, the elderly janitor who had always treated me with more kindness and respect than my own blood relatives ever did. I picked up the phone at the next red light and opened the message. It was a photograph of Mr. Harrison and his entire beautiful family sitting proudly in the front row VIP seats at my graduation ceremony earlier that afternoon. His wife was beaming with genuine joy, holding up a handmade sign with my name painted in bright colors. Beneath the picture was a text message that made my throat tighten with pure emotion. "Thank you, my child," the message read. "You looked absolutely radiant today, on that stage. We are all so incredibly proud of you and the amazing woman you have become." A single tear slipped down my cheek, but it was not a tear of grief or betrayal or sadness. It was a tear of pure, unburdened happiness. I smiled, wiping the tear away, and feeling a profound sense of peace settle deep into my bones. I put the phone down and pressed the accelerator, driving faster toward the vibrant lights of the city. I was heading straight to a private rooftop restaurant where my real team, my loyal colleagues, and my true chosen family were already waiting to celebrate my master's degree and my historic corporate acquisition. They were the people who actually saw my worth, who celebrated my brilliance, and who stood by my side when the battles were hardest. I had walked through the fire of their manipulation and emerged completely untouched. The road ahead was wide open, and it belonged entirely to me. I rolled down the window, letting the evening wind rush over my face as I drove toward a future that was finally, truly, and unapologetically mine. This story teaches us that our true worth is never defined by those who fail to value us, even if they share our blood. Real strength comes from building your own foundation, rejecting toxic manipulation, and having the courage to walk away from conditional love. When you stop seeking validation from people who only want to exploit you, you finally open the door to genuine peace, self-respect, and a magnificent legacy built entirely on your own terms. Share your own experiences of setting boundaries with toxic family members in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe for more empowering stories. This story teaches us that our true worth is never defined by those who fail to value us, even if they share our blood. Real strength comes from building your own foundation, rejecting toxic manipulation, and having the courage to walk away from conditional love. When you stop seeking validation from people who only want to exploit you, you finally open the door to genuine peace, self-respect, and a magnificent legacy built entirely on your own terms. Share your own experiences of setting boundaries with toxic family members in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe for more empowering stories.